studios.
Are they?
With originals?
Yeah, in fact, the little town and wherever it was back east, they went in and saw a YouTube video where they're actually reconstructing the town, rebuilt the house on the hill. And it looks the same. I don't know. They're pretty quiet about it. Rebuilt the bridge where the car went off. I don't know if it's a rehash of the old one or a continuation or
Michael Keaton.
Michael Keaton?
I don't know. They didn't say.
He reprised his Batman role. Why doesn't he in that multiverse?
I'm Dead Man.
I read an article yesterday about some scuba divers. I don't know how this came about, but in the bottom of Lake Lucerne,
Jacques Cousteau,
in Switzerland, they found a town, a village that dates back to the Bronze Era, between 3000 and 1200 BC, that places civilization in that region 2,000 years earlier than they suspected.
Wow.
But there's like a whole
Chris, your
village.
levels have dropped considerably. You're in the minus 30.
Yeah, I could do this.
I knew you could.
Well, has someone been playing with the Dial of Destiny in France? That's what I want.
I don't know. Super interesting, though, right?
Yes, indeed. Now we can really blame the French for everything because they were there first.
No, this is Switzerland.
Oh,
Switzerland is different than France.
Where did you say it was?
Lucerne,
Switzerland.
Lake Lucerne in Switzerland.
Lake Lucerne.
Yeah.
Isn't that a cheese spread?
It's a safe. I don't know. Yeah, no, I've been super interested in prehistory stuff lately.
Prehistory, like according to what? To whom?
What's generally taught and has been taught for the last few hundred years?
Oh, it's conspiracy theory.
It's not a conspiracy theory. It's science, John. Period. Just because
Alex,
you don't
welcome
believe
in.
it doesn't mean it's not true.
Your levels good, Alex, since last time? Good.
Yeah, they're good. We just tested them. Gotta go for a second.
It's a Nigerian proverb. Let's see what. Until the lion has a historian, the hunter will always be the hero.
I don't.
Aesop's fables.
I don't understand what that means.
You really?
I'm a simple man, Jason.
We weren't 90 seconds out. I'd explain it to you.
Have a good show, folks.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find out more about what we do at officehours.global. Our first hour is general discussion about media and virtual production. And our second hour is usually something we want to spend a little bit more time on. And today we've got our own Alan Hawkes, and he's going to be walking us through the entire production pipeline when we're dealing with 3D production, 3D as in 3D models, not stereo production. And each month he's going to be talking about a different a different piece of that pipeline. Today he's going to be talking about the overall pipeline, so that should be a great second hour. So save your questions for that for the second hour. Go ahead and throw. You don't have to save them. You can go ahead and throw them into Makana. Also, if you have questions for the first hour, pretty much anything around digital media production, go ahead and throw it in right now for that first hour. Go ahead, Mitch. What do we got?
Thank you, Alex. First in, John Snyder in Reno, Nevada, with a real techie question. Netflix is using Magenta lighting and ML to optimize green screen technology. Discuss the benefits and negatives to this approach.
Go ahead, Mitch.
Yeah, I looked it over. It's really interesting. What the folks at Netflix are doing is they're doing green screen as normal, but what they're doing is they're lighting the foreground talent with magenta light, which would be the red and blue. So the separation of those colors and the fact that you're in the wheelhouse for the separation in the post process means that you're going to get a cleaner plate. The only caveat is that now you have to color correct the foreground to get the green back in that you took out. And usually they're discussing an AI of some kind that's doing that. And I'm thinking, aren't we just a step away from just going all in with the AI and letting the AI separate us from any background? But this seems to be a step in that direction.
Go ahead, Courtney.
I think the advantages are that they can just pull the raw green channel from the camera and use that, invert that, and use it as the whole back matte, because it just has the pure green information since there is no green in the foreground. And Chris has a picture of it up there. The disadvantages of it, so it gives you a cleaner matte, especially with transparency and light hair and so on, because all colors are going to, the sensor. But you're only lighting the only reflected light that is lit, only light that is red and blue is hitting the foreground, and so the colors that the people are wearing is reflected that red and blue light. But and there's no green to reflect off of it. That lets them also, since they're correcting it back, they have to shoot a reference with normal white light on the foreground. And they then put a color chart up and shoot a reference. And then they build a custom LUT for each color in the scene using AI to correct the color shifted, magenta back to full color. But that way it allows you to actually have characters wearing green in front of a green screen or different colors of green without worrying about it being transparent. The other disadvantage is you have to have lights that are RGB W because you have to switch between normal white or tungsten or daylight illumination and red-blue illumination combo. So you have to be fairly agile in your lighting. Otherwise, you have to have two sets of lights. So it works with LED lighting. I'm not sure how well it's going to work otherwise. It's going to drive the actors crazy because their color vision will be screwed up when they leave the set.
Yeah, go Jason.
Yeah, my immediate thought was, unlike the extremely simple setup that they show in the article, a lot like lighting an entire foreground completely evenly cannot be easy. That's got to be a complex thing. I'm looking at that deep magenta and thinking I would have a very hard time just keeping my head on straight throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, I don't think you need to do it evenly. I think it's just a matter of filling that light. But the real issue is that the actor's performance matters, and when everybody looks weird, it's going to be harder for them to get into character. And so it's just we've done. I mean, I've done lots of weird things trying to get a better key. The reality is, a very flat green screen gets everything. like it just really does. That you can get every little hair, and it's way better than almost any composite that you see on most feature films. The problem is not that they don't have the perfect magenta or whatever. The problem is the green screen is horribly lit. If you look at the behind the scenes, the green screens are horribly lit. They've got seams. They've got all kinds of other things going on. They're so far away from a perfect solution that this is trying to weed out 1% of the problem when 10% of the problem or 20% of the problem is still there. It's just it's accurate. It's shooting for accuracy beyond the precision. So I think that it's something that makes sense in the lab, and they're obviously in the lab. I would love to see a movie actually shot with this, and have them persuade a director to actually use this. So we'll see if it actually happens. Next question.
Next question in from Douglas Carmichael. The Atomos NinjaCast seems to have taken influences from the ATEM software control app in their desktop UI, Universal Interface. How does it compare to an ATEM Mini?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, just looked at it. I think the biggest difference is there's a built-in monitor, which is kind of handy. I do like Atomos products. They're obviously responding to the proliferation and success that Blackmagic has with the ATEM. So it's maybe a little bit smaller, but I don't have any practical experience to share.
And where does it? Do we know how much it costs? I don't know what the price is of it.
I didn't look. Sorry.
It's got one of these horrible web pages that looks really cool, but you can't actually get the information that you need. It's those scrolling ones where it's got one picture after another picture, and nowhere does it have an actual price. So it's priceless. Go ahead,
Found it,
Courtney.
$750.
Okay, got it. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Courtney.
okay, good. That was the question. Yeah, that was the question I had. Is if they're going to compete against ATEM, they have to compete on price, because ATEM, an ATEM Mini is $295. So they're nowhere near competing with them there, but it has a built-in monitor. So I guess it has that advantage.
Yeah. It'd be interesting. I mean, I think that I'd have to play with it to see if it distinguishes itself. Right now, I don't necessarily want my monitor connected to my switcher. That's the problem is that they're doing something that I actually don't want to do. But I can see how some creators might think that that's better to have a monitor just plugged in. But you have now a small monitor that you don't have any choice of how you're going to undo it. I want the monitor I have, the switcher I have, to fit into a rack, not go the other direction. Next question.
From Craig Kadoki in Toronto, Canada. At last weekend's F1 race, Brad Pitt's movie had full access to the grid and the track, even having their own garage and being in the pre-race ceremony. Along with the awesome camera setups, talk about how this access affects the main production.
It's super expensive to reproduce an F1 race. I think that's the issue. So it's just, there's incredible millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars, potentially approaching the budget of the entire movie would take to reproduce, to get all those people there, to get all that stuff there. It's much easier to just shoot it, find and so that they can, and so I think that's probably why they did that. They probably still paid them a lot of money to do it, but I think that it's probably just much more cost effective to do it. And we see this a lot. There's a lot of productions where you get opportunistic and you try to shoot at things. And if you're in a public location and people aren't necessarily, you can post things and just tell people, hey, this is going to be on air. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, if you go back to the old movie Grand Prix, you get a lot of chances to see actual race drivers everybody knows in situ, and they're not acting, they're just doing their job. That's kind of cool to see that.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, the hard part is that if you have to, a lot of times they will do stuff like shoot at a football game, and they will gather background plates of the crowd and the opposing team, and a lot of shots that they'll pick up. Any of the main dialogue scenes, they'll leave that for later in the green screen stage, or back in the same stadium, or F1 track with the crowd gone on an off day, and they'll shoot all that, and then they'll composite in the backgrounds with the crowds in them when they have to in the shots like that. So the difficulty comes in trying to match the cars in the fictional movie with the cars that appeared on that day in the track. So it's a tough job for the art department and the having to dress out the prop cars to look like the real ones that appear. So it's tougher for them to match that stuff if they have to interact with any of the foreground material.
Go ahead, Chris.
Obviously, nothing's going to happen unless it benefits both parties. But if the Brad Pitt movie, which I know nothing about, is very pro F1 racing, the F1 people may look at it as, well, it'll bring even a larger audience to F1, clearly they're going to spend a lot of money. But yeah, it would be much easier to just, shoot it for real than to try and fake it all.
Next question.
Paul Wallace in Austin, Texas, asking, how do you get verified on Threads?
I think you can Google that. I don't know. This isn't really a graphics question, and I don't know how to do it. I got my name, and then I took it off my computer my phone because I like battery life. Next question.
From Craig Kadoki in Toronto, Canada, using an iPhone 13 Pro as a webcam on Ventura. Can you select which lens the camera uses, or is it always the wide angle? Any tips and tricks to make this even better? Webcam settings don't work with continuity camera. Any other options for fine-tuning?
Go ahead, Javier.
I think if you're using the continuity, like the native continuity capabilities of the OS, you can select the lens. You have like the fixed lens. I don't think it's the wide eye. I think it's the regular, like the one you open, the 1.0, and you can only use like the desk view. That I think it's using like the wider one, like cutting it. But if you want to have control over that, you can use something like shoot video, shoot camera. That app lets you select from different lenses. You can have like the 1x, the 0.5, or the 3x. So it depends. If you want to do it, you have to do like a third party app. If you use like the regular app, you're not going to be able to switch lenses.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I've had a similar problem with the continuity camera, that it appears to default to using the blurry background feature, and I have no idea how to turn that off. It's frustrating.
Yeah, I don't think that. I think I would use continuity camera out of convenience, but if I was actually going to use it for a show like this, I would use something like Shoot or Filmic or something else. I wouldn't use the continuity camera for this kind of operation, because you just don't have it, as both Javier and Chris said, you just don't have the control that you need to make that work. And there are plenty of other apps that do give you that control. So I think continuity camera is really nice if you don't know anything about how to do this and you just want to plug it in and it just works. That's what that's what it's great for. As soon as you want to do anything specific, like start to fiddle with lenses, you should probably just get an app. Next question.
Mike Edwards from Brooklyn, New York, asking, morning, everyone. What was the KVM the panel suggested before? I want to connect a PC and a Mac without using two different keyboards and mice. Thanks.
Go ahead, Jason.
I've used so many over the years. I've used StarTex. I've used IO gears. I've even used the cheap ones from Monoprice. I don't have a strong favorite if you just need a simple A/B switch. It gets a little bit more important if you're going to go beyond two computers.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button there. Yeah, I use a P-Way. It's I can actually pull one out because I poured tea on one of them and it died. So it doesn't handle tea well. So this is the one that this is the stunt one now. Anyway, there's a couple things about this P-Way, and it's listed as something else on Amazon of all things, but it says P-Way on the top. It's a 4K HDMI USB KVM. I don't use the HDMIs at all, but I got 4K just in case I decide I want to eventually. Here's the thing that I like about it is that it's small, but most importantly, buttons are on the front, so I can push it on the front. If they're on the top or somewhere else, you can't stack anything on them. The interface for the keyboard and mouse are on the front. Again, I want to be able to just plug things into it, make it work. Everything else is on the back, and I'm pointing these out because a lot of these don't have this. So these are all on the back, and it's square. I mean, they have all kinds of funky shapes for these. And so this one does 4, and I use all 4, and it's look, it's $60. I don't know if it's the best one, but it's the one that I've been using for years. I mean, this one until I poured tea on it, and then I got another one that looks slightly different, but it's almost identical to this. So anyway, I think it's the best one I've used. I don't use these a lot, and again, I don't use the monitor part. I have so many other things to route monitors. I just needed to get the keyboard, and it does that great. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, the KVM or KV switch that I use, it's an interesting form factor in that it's a puck that has a spider that you plug in into all your computers, and then there's a remote push button that's right next to my keyboard, and it's just this blap, 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 blap. It sounds just like that, blap, blap. And it rotates through the 4 computers.
Which would drive me crazy.
What's that?
That would drive me crazy.
The noise or the rotation?
Lack of precision. Then I'd have to go through every monitor to get to the one that I want.
Yeah, but it's a simple form factor, and I don't have to have it. I got to say, it kind of works.
Okay.
And I can just step through. And then what I did, it's ridiculous, but I took the thing that has the spider on it, has indicator lights. So I mounted it in a small rig mounty thing, and I put it right underneath my camera lens so I could see which computer is lit up.
That's the geekiest KVM ever. Go ahead.
Yeah, and here's for something completely different. I have an ancient Blackmagic box behind me. It's a multi-switch, and you put a card in it for each type of computer that it's going to be switching. So you can mix Solaris, Mac, PC, whatever, and it negotiates the communication protocols between it. It's a keyboard shortcut, which I like.
That's cool. Next question.
From Nicole Kolkar from New Jersey. Sorry about that. When doing real-time compositing with Ultimate HD, Unreal Engine with a tracked camera, how can I have a moving garbage mat piped into the Blackmagic that crops out the area around the green screen, which doesn't fill up the entire frame?
Good, Courtney.
That's kind of tricky. We did something like this in the movie Multiplicity, and it was all done with motion control cameras and articulated splits. So that would be moving as the camera moves, so that we could do split screens with Michael Keaton playing 2 different actors, and depending upon where the camera was, the split had to move. And we had an onset device that let us in real time see the playback of the split performance with the live performance. And it was very tricky. And back then there was no camera, there was no, real-time camera tracking. So it was all done with SMPTE-driven, time code-driven motion control. The problem you're going to run into here is even if you have camera tracking, if you have a small green screen, which means you have to have a garbage mat to fill up the rest of the frame, if the camera moves or the actor moves in relationship to the camera, the parallax is going to change, and the actor could walk out from between the green screen and the background. Or the camera could move when the parallax changes. It could position the person off. You'd shoot off the green screen without a means of replacing it with the foreground action. So I think the easier way would just be to, bite the bullet and get a bigger green screen.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways probably to given that you're already using Unreal Engine, you're already tracking it in real time. You could actually take just cards. So you could create another Unreal camera and just create cards, and those cards could either be green that matches the green that's behind them, or just white, and use it to generate an alpha channel. But it would then track with it. Because it's going to be as good as the track that you already have. And so you could place those over top of the, bounding around that. So that would be, you would have your main Unreal camera that is what you're shooting, and then you would have another camera that you just add into the scene that has that can be shooting any direction. And you just have to apply the tracking to both of them. It'd probably take a little bit of setup, but it would definitely give you either pure green or an alpha channel around the area that you had there. Yeah, go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, Nikhil, I would try to talk you out of doing this in real time, unless there's a real reason you got to do it. In post, you got a lot more options, and it's a lot easier to track that garbage mat, whether you're using Mocha or some kind of tracking software.
I'm assuming because he's using Unreal and everything else and Ultimate that he needs to do it in real time. He's probably a digital set. And so if that's the case, then I think that you'd be able to build that mat again with that process. Next question.
Next question from Bo Cordell in Charleston, South Carolina. If I'm looking for a few mini PCs, should I lean towards new B-Links or Melees by Courtney or refurbished HP Elite desktops? There are good options for both in the sub $300 range.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
I'm a fan of staying cool. The idea of the small guy, I think the smaller they are, the hotter they get. If you have something a little bit bigger, I'm a fan of HP, so I would lean that direction.
There you go, Courtney.
Yeah, it depends on whether you need fanless or not, because if you're in a situation where you got to have an open microphone nearby, you want to have fanless. These the design of the melees are designed with this ribbed, ribbed outline, ribbed cases that are made of a composite plastic and carbon, I think, that radiate heat. It's the heat radiator, so they do get warm. So you don't want to, be having it on your lap, but they work quite well for that kind of stuff. B-Link you can get in a more heftier processors. They all do have fans in them though now these days, so you have to take that into consideration. But you can get a Ryzen 9 with a B-Link that is quite capable with doing graphics and with a large number of cores that satisfy the people at Zoom who tend to discriminate against us for quad-core machines. But any of those smaller PCs that run Windows Pro should work for you as long as you're not having to do 1080p output to Zoom. They all handle 4K output on all the HDMI outputs, 4K 60. But outputting to Zoom, they still discriminate if you don't have more than 4 cores.
Yeah, and I think those are great PCs. There are a lot of small form factor that I'm starting to pay a lot more attention to. One is the new Turing RK1. So the Turing RK1 has, it's basically a Jetson pin layout, and it's really powerful. so take a look at the specs on the RK1. Also, there is a LinkPi ENC5 version 2 video encoder, 5 4K 30 HDMI inputs that it will encode all of them at the same time. But I think that one, and if you look at the place to find that is cnx-software.com. So I've been doing some research on some of these smaller form factors that are, sub $300. So if you need a PC, you need a PC. But some of these other ones, are raw boards that you might be interested in as you go forward. Now, next question.
From Paul Wallace in Austin, Texas. Wow! OpenAI releases Code Interpreter, a ChatGPT plugin developed in-house to all Plus subscribers, helping them analyze data, create charts, edit files. Please comment.
Go ahead, John.
Code Interpreter, which is a plugin for GPT-4 Plus, if you're a paying member, is basically a Python playground inside of GPT. It's a step in the right direction. Real programmers are calling this a toy, but it does do some cool stuff. When we can do what we can do with Jarvis, I'll be very excited.
Don't real programmers call everything a toy? Oh, that's just a toy. You're not writing in machine language, like it's so yeah, it's fun. We'll see how it goes. A quick reminder that of course you can ask questions anytime during the first hour or second hour, so go ahead and throw your questions in. We've got a great panel here. Today is the graphics day, so if you've got questions around computer graphics, whether it's 3D or 2D or stereo or all those things, we've got some folks here that can answer those questions, so definitely throw those in, and we'll be talking about graphics of course in the second hour as Alan is going to walk us through the overall CG pipeline. So if you've got questions about that, go ahead and throw them in. And remember to vote on the questions so we know what order you'd like us to ask them in. Next question.
And it's here from Roscoe Jones in Madison, Indiana. Can you plug a UPS into another UPS to lengthen the time the first one supplies power once the power goes out?
Go ahead, Jason.
I'm really glad you asked this. This is a really bad idea because when everything loses AC at the same time, they're going to try to start loading off of each other, and you're just going to have a big mess.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, it's not a good idea to do that. They're not intended for that use. In fact, strip outlets should not be daisy-chained either. It's just a bad idea technically and electrically.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, because most of these have surge suppressors in them, which are metal oxide varistors that are designed not to be put in parallel against other metal oxide varistors. So it's a bad idea to daisy chain them. Better idea is if you have two UPSs, take the battery out of the second one and parallel connect it to the first one, and then you'll get twice the runtime off the first UPS if that's what you're intending to do. And that'd be the safest way to do it.
Go ahead, Chris.
Roscoe, you're missing a real great opportunity here. What you want to do is take the cable from number A, UPS A, plug it into B, take B, plug it into A. Now you have perpetual power. You're good to go for the rest of eternity.
Nothing will go wrong at all. Yeah, one of the things that we do a lot of is split things up. So, it's hard. At some point, you can't split it up anymore. But the real way to extend the life, of course, is to just get more UPSs. And don't put them in parallel, don't put them in series, but in parallel, as Courtney said, and just keep on splitting things out. So, for instance, my lights sit on a different UPS than my computers, which sit on a different UPS than my router. And so they all have their own UPSs. The router will last 6 hours. If we lose power, you lose it often enough here in California, you start getting you start getting good at this. Go ahead, Mitchell.
For the record, Chris Fenwick does not necessarily represent the opinions of Office Hours and its subsidiaries.
I still think we should do it and just take a video and see what happens. Next question.
Mike Edwards from Brooklyn, New York. Panel, would you like to recommend purchasing 2 different USB hubs and docks for 2 different computers, or attempt to split the USB-C into both computers? Thanks.
I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can't really split that. You got to pick one. So I would get 2 different USB docks. And again, I would really recommend OWC in this area. I bought a lot of different docks, and I haven't really been happy with any of the other ones. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, this just in, don't ever do that.
Yeah. So, and I will say that I got a smaller dock from Uni or whatever, and it's working pretty well. It's interesting. The Ethernet didn't work on the little splitter dock that I got. The Ethernet didn't work, but it works on the large one. It's a little box with a little short cable. I can't think of the name of it, but as a really inexpensive little dock, it's worked okay. Next question.
Roscoe Jones from Madison, Indiana's back. Any warnings to using a UPS as a field battery when no power is available? Needing to use a T-Mobile 5G modem to upload a stream for an hour. I've got 2 APC 1500s, batteries, and units.
Go ahead, Jason.
In theory, that could work. There's an issue, though. Usually when they lose AC power, you'll start to hear a hum, and a lot of them have a tone to warn you that the power is out, so be careful.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, when I would do it, like Jason said, it could work, but most of the UPSs are only designed to work have about 20 minutes, 10 to 20 to 30 minutes at most to supply power to whatever's hooked up to them to allow you to shut it down gracefully. A better choice would be just to buy a high quality sine wave inverter and get a big hunkin' battery and just use that. And with that kind of a setup, you can turn it on and operate for 4 or 5 hours, depending upon the size of your battery and the power delivery of your inverter. That's what we used on the Cinegear to supply us with some AC power on the cart all day long. So it does work.
Good, Chris.
Yeah, but Alex, you just mentioned that your router is set up to run for 6 hours on the UPS,
yeah,
right?
It's just draw. It's just how much draw. I mean, 20 minutes is if it's at full. 15 to 20 minutes is if it's at full load. The load on a 5G modem is almost. I mean, I don't know what 5G modem you're using, but it would be almost zero. Like it's really not taking up very much power at all. The question really is if the T-Mobile, if that 5G modem requires AC, I don't know if it does, but if it requires AC, then you might need something to convert that. But it probably is a USB-C or micro USB connection if it's the ones that I'm used to using, or a barrel, like the little barrel. So you've got a wall wart that's going to be a AC to 12 volt or probably 5 volt, goes into the wall wart. The interesting thing is I don't think if I have one sitting here, but Small Rig makes what's called the 99 battery, and it's got a V-mount, and it's a little battery. It's got a little display on the front. And it's got USB, D-tap, and barrel connectors in the side of it. You can just, that thing will probably run that modem for a day. It's literally this big. Now, if you really want to use the UPSs that you have, it will make that noise. The 1500s, the APC 1500s will make that noise. You can't open the 1500s up and take the noise out. We've done that because we've definitely used them the way we had a shot where we needed to have 2 LEDs, and they were part of a set that we rolled in and out of the set, and we had a UPS for each one of these little sets. There were 3 of them, and we ran the LED lights and everything else, all the little LEDs that were in the set, from one of these UPS 1500s. Now, it only needed to run for 10 minutes, but it was a lot more power. It was a lot more power draw than what you're having there. But we had to surgically remove the buzzers because, of course, it was on set, and we didn't want to make any noise.
I was going to say, when Alex says take the noise out, to be clear, he's not actually grabbing noise. He's removing the device that makes noise. So it's a bit of a euphemism he was working there. Take the noise out just means disable it.
We have a magician that can just take the noise out. They just go like this, and it's I can't get it to work, but this is the motion that they do, and then it doesn't make any noise. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, you're kind of working backwards here. If your 5G modem is a thing that you need to keep running, look at it's probably running on DC, so it probably has a wall wart that delivers DC to the modem. Find out what the voltage is for that modem, and just get a battery that can go to that. And there's these for like $8 if you're a little bit, ingenious here. You can buy these boost or buck converters that'll take 3.5 to 28 volts in and can adjust up or down to any voltage out up to 3 amps. So just get one of those. Take the output of your 12-volt battery or 9-volt battery or whatever battery you end up with, adjust the output to the voltage that the modem requires, and you could run, all day long on that battery, probably with that little DC to DC converter on there, and you wouldn't go through the trouble of having to convert, DC to AC in an inverter or in a UPS, and then that AC back to DC to run the modem. It's very inefficient doing it that way. Just run it off a battery.
All I know is that I was today years old when I knew that there was a DC to DC variable converter. That's really cool. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, absolutely tangential what Courtney just said. There's a bunch of videos of guys running their entire streaming rigs on these like Geniverse batteries. That Chris, don't you have one of those batteries? They're running all day long on these little Geniverse battery systems, and DC to DC is the way to go. Just like Courtney said.
You good, Chris?
If you want to learn about battery technology, definitely talk to like Jack and Keenan in After Hours. Those guys are mad scientists. I want to say to Courtney, I really appreciate the way your mind works. And I will say that there are 2 different ways of solving problems. There is the Lego method, and then there is the Heathkit method. And Courtney is a master of the Heathkit method. Courtney, you do things routinely that are 2 to 3 levels above where my mind works. I am much more like the Lego method. Buy this thing, plug this thing in. But you're like mad scientist, and I really appreciate that. I can never solve the problems that you solve unless I have you to ask how to help. Anyway, I appreciate the way your mind works.
Next question.
From Nikhil Kamkovar from New Jersey. From a filmmaking point of view, I'm invested in Canon EF glass, and I'm wondering if moving to RF is the way to go. I know there are adapters available. Also, in terms of camera systems, Sony or Canon is a religious war, but thoughts on pros and cons of each?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, you're right. There are plenty of adapters. Megabones is probably the best one if you want to go between a Canon and a Sony.
Metabones?
Metabones. Yeah, the little circular thing there.
Megabones.
Megabones, whatever. One of those little guys. And you stick it on there. Here's the thing with the Sony. I'm definitely a Sony fanboy, as you all well know. The thing with Sony is they communicate so well with their E-mount lenses, especially if you're doing that great autofocus. You need a high-speed lens that talks Sony to do that. Other ones can do it, but just not quite as well. So that's my pitch for the Sony side of things. And then as far as your investment, with Canon, they're pretty darn good.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, what do they say? You date your camera and you marry your lenses. So the thing about getting heavily into a lens is you're going to save a ton of money if you stick to that. There are multiple stories in social media past, which I won't go into, a very prominent photographer people throwing their hands up and saying, "Oh, I hate Canon now. I'm moving everything to Nikon." And then 2 years later, I'm going back to Canon. And like literally selling all their glass and stuff. And it's just, I definitely subscribe to, pick one and go with it. And, maybe you've made a mistake, but, your career won't last forever. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I mean the R5 is definitely the RF in general is a superior system to the Canon EFs. So it is an upgrade. The real problem is that the Canon is tired of other people making lenses without paying them for them. So what Canon did is they've encoded their system so that you have to license the RF system from them as opposed to the EF, so that you need to pay them for every lens you sell. And so you can tell that they're desperate to make sure they keep on making money, and because they were looking at Tamron and all the other camera manufacturers that were able to use the RF system. So that's been that's why the RFs are a little bit controversial in that sense. I don't know I don't know if the RF, I don't think the Metabones, I don't know if it can manage the communication between the camera and the lens. I think it can adapt it, but I think you need to have an all manual lens to do that. I will say I find that the Sony, I agree with Mitch that the Sony autofocus is superior. I am looking at getting an R5 though, a Canon R5, and that's specifically because there is an R5 lens that I'm interested in. It's the dual 180 lens. So as we get ready for production for the Vision, the dual 180 lens is interesting to me. So anyway, so we're and it's the only one. Now some people are putting those dual 180s on the R5, and some people are putting them on the Raptor, and so the red Raptor, and so I'm looking at kind of experimenting in those areas. Go, Jason.
Yeah, Metabones has repeatedly annoyed me, and here's why. They're 93% perfect. And that is so infuriating. And you mess with the firmware and you clean it and you're like, oh, okay, got to get the contacts right. And then it's like 93.5. And you've just wasted like 6 hours. That's what drives me crazy about Metabones. Oh, and they're $700.
Next question.
Next one in from Robert Sababity from Poland. I'm using Zoom ISO, the latest beta, and recently my internet dropped during an event and the Zoom ISO Mac Mini lost connection with Zoom. Anyone have any idea how to make Zoom ISO reestablish the connection with the Zoom meeting short of rebooting?
Well, you might have to restart Zoom ISO. I don't know if you're trying to not restart Zoom ISO or not restart the whole computer. I don't know why you would need to restart the whole computer. And we've lost it. It's definitely worth putting a ticket in or trying to test that, because I have not had that problem specifically. Go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, if you've lost connection with Zoom, just, a Mac Mini is going to reboot pretty quick. I would just reboot it in a panic. Obviously, you want to get to a state where you don't have these kind of problems. And I would agree with Alex. Definitely let Zoom know that they've been super responsive to our input.
Yeah, and if it's actually a bug, they'll fix it, I'm sure, within the next link. The next if you file a ticket. The most important thing to do is file a ticket, and to make sure that they know. But it's probably one of the most responsive teams that we've ever worked with. So I think that you can probably file a ticket there, and they'll take a look at it. The other thing you can do is remember that multiple Zoom ISOs multiple computers can go into the same meeting and pull out those ISOs. So if you're really concerned about this problem, the other option is you could theoretically have two Mac Minis that were each in the meeting and each grabbing all the same feeds and on two different internet connections. I mean, if you start thinking about redundant builds for high profile events, you could do that, and then you have a button that just changes the routing, that if something goes down, you'd be able to move over to the other one. So that might be another option in the meantime. And generally, having a primary and backup is always a good idea, as if you're working in high profile events. Next question.
Here's Paul Wallace from Austin, Texas, with a question. For anyone using DaVinci Resolve, are you finding better control of color correction and grading when you opt not to use DaVinci Color Managed Project settings?
I almost always use DaVinci Color Managed Project settings, so I don't really have I'm not sure what it would be like to not do that. So anyway, if you're asking what I think you're asking, it may be, but I haven't.
What does that mean, Alex?
There's a bunch of different inside of Resolve. You have project setups, and you can decide how it's going to be how the color is going to be managed. And there's a lot of it's the one. really tricky part of Resolve. In Final Cut, you just kind of open it up and you throw it in there and it all starts to work, which is why when I'm doing something quick, I don't go into Resolve. But in Resolve, you can start setting up, okay, this is what the project is going to be. This is how we're going to manage that color. And that's all in the project settings or and so inside of there, you can set up, this is the display, this is the LUT between these things, this is how this is all set up. When you're working on a technical event or technical edit where color, is going to be managed, it's why you use Resolve instead of Final Cut. I mean, like it's, like you just turn it, you go like, okay, we're going to use this because, some people will edit all in Final Cut and then send it to Resolve to be, to have the color done. Sometimes I think that might be faster. so because the edit is so much faster in Final Cut, but Final Cut's color management is woefully behind Resolve's, and also its sound management and so on and so forth. And so it's really difficult if you're doing, for instance, HDR work or really really high quality stuff. Sometimes it's just easier to build it, but in general, you really have to kind of know what you're doing. Resolve is very hard to just open up and start editing. It's a grown-up app that requires some knowledge before you turn it on. Next question.
Next one in from Kenny Hampton in Greenville, Illinois. Please explain a bit about the tech behind Bluetooth. Which radio band is used, one-way transmission or some form of duplex? Do you foresee a time when this tech will find stable use in production?
Go, Jason.
Well, it does have a stable use in production, at least unstable productions. Bluetooth is a mishmash of the host stack and the controller stack, and the handshake between the two is extremely complicated and may or may not work. And if you've ever bought really cheap earbuds, you've heard the oddities that happen when Bluetooth switches protocols midstream. It's a huge mishmash, and it's not an easy thing to explain in 30 seconds.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, if you do want to take a really deep dive and go to Bluetooth.com specifications, they've got a great website there, and just look at all these documentations. Bluetooth has been a moving target for more than a decade now, and there's all these different protocols that were adopted and then deprecated and adopted and deprecated, and there is a white paper on each one of them, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. So you can't exactly explain it. It's generally in the 2.4 gigahertz range, but I think some Bluetooth LE may be up in 5 gigahertz on licensed range. Usually those are the two ranges that they operate in because they don't interfere with licensed RF transmission.
Go ahead, Chris.
I used to work with a producer who gave us a courtesy call once and said, "Hey, by the way, you're not going to be hearing from me anymore. I just started at a new company. I'm like employee number 4 or 5 or something like that. And it's going to be really big. You haven't heard of it yet." "Well, what is it?" "Oh, it's called Bluetooth. You'll be hearing about it." Never heard from her again.
And we would like to take this moment to thank Hedy Lamar for Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and cellular. All right, next question.
That's right. Skip, was that frequency hopping? Good
Yep.
stuff. Nikhil Kamkokar in New Jersey. There's a lot of chatter, it seems, about in-camera video effects as a hot job market. Thoughts? And if you were to focus on working in IC VFX, what would be the future-proofed skill set to focus on giving AI green screen versus LED, et cetera?
I think that in-camera visual effects is going to be a big deal. Now, this is what you're seeing in Mandalorian. This is what you're seeing in a lot of other things where you're trying to get everything done in the camera in real time. I think that I don't know exactly what skills. A lot of times, it's hard to say these are the skills for this because a lot of times you don't know until you're 5 years into it what the actual skills are going to be. I think that tracking is important. Unreal Engine is important. People will ask, well, should it be Unreal or Unity? And it probably should be Unreal because Epic spent a lot of time and effort. If you're developing for the Apple Vision, then Unity makes more sense because Apple and Epic don't get along very well. So that's why you're seeing a lot of Unity support on the Apple platform. But if you're looking at in-camera visual effects, versions of Unreal, whether it's Unreal itself or not, are really, really kind of own that because they built a lot of broadcast syncing tools into it. And so it's probably understanding Unreal, understanding tracking, finding a place to work in those areas, I think are important. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I guess for the area, there's two areas. There's the virtual set soundstage, which uses the LED walls, and then what you're talking about, green screen. They do a lot of pre-visualization on set where they'll have temps of the 3D backgrounds that they're going to be working on and laying in later and compositing those with a temp composite on set so that the camera operators and the director can see what the eventual composite's going to be if they're shooting on a green screen stage. So those kind of tools have been around for a long time. The LED walls are just getting to the point with the high enough resolution to use in-camera visual effects. If you're shooting a green screen, it's probably not an in-camera visual effects except for previs, and so it's not permanent because the later high-quality compositing will be done later when the graphics are all done and fine-tuned. The problem with working this way of doing in-camera visual effects with an LED wall is you've got to have all your ducks in a row ahead of time. You've got to have all your backgrounds laid out, generated, designed, and lit. And, before you go onto the soundstage, because that soundstage is very expensive to operate with all that equipment and the main actors in there. So you got to make sure all the graphics are lined up, ready to go. You don't want to make any decisions that would cause you to have to, redesign the background other than moving stuff around on the set because it can get very expensive. So those are considerations.
Good, Mitchell.
Yeah, a good example of in-camera video effects, the recently released Oppenheimer film. I think Chris Nolan, the director, used almost all exclusively in-camera effects on it. So kind of neat to see something that potentially effects crazy and heavy being done with the camera, and it still doesn't interfere with the story.
By the way, that I watched Mission Impossible. I'm trying to go through all the Mission Impossibles over the next week so that I can go see Mission Impossible next week before it goes out of the IMAX theaters. And the funny thing is I didn't realize there's kind of a joke on Tom Cruise that's hidden in the behind the scenes. So there's a shot of him on the train. And of him on the train, and that was all shot in front of blue screen. I mean, I saw plates, so it's all shot in front of blue screen, and the way they cut it together, and I think that someone at ILM must have cut it together. So you see Joe Lettieri and you see John Knoll talking about it, and they've got things set up. There's a longer cut of that I've seen, and I thought that that's what I was going to see when I opened up the DVD, but they cut out the shots of the miniatures of the train, and they cut out the shots of the of him on the blue screen, because it was a really good, every time I see it at that time in the early 90s, it was a really good comp. I was always impressed with how the comp, but there's a shot of Tom Cruise saying, when the train was at speed, you really have to hang on to the train, and the way that they cut it, there was obviously a joke there of him talking about it and then them showing the visual effects. And then eventually somebody figured out that it was in the extras and they took it out. They cut it a little shorter so that you never see Tom Cruise with a big fan on a still train in front of a green screen or blue screen. And it was but I realized that I didn't realize it until last night that the editor, which I think was probably from ILM, putting these things together, was kind of telling a joke on Tom Cruise when he was younger, of him talking about the physical effects. So when we say, the reason I say this is that when people say that they did a lot of visual effects on this and it's all in camera, we should always take that with a grain of salt. There's an awful lot of visual effects that get done outside of that. And most of these folks that say it's all done in cameras are full of something that I can't talk about on this show. Anyway, go ahead, Mitchell.
I was just going to say, you may think you're cool, but you're not as cool as Chuck Norris standing on the two wings of the two Air Force jets while he's calmly traveling somewhere.
Exactly. Next question.
Paul Wallace in Austin, Texas. What AI tools are most accessible?
Midjourney and ChatGPT. I think those are probably the two that are the most accessible. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael asking, the Atomos Zato Connect can convert a USB webcam into HDMI. If you wanted a high-quality monitor top camera as part of a larger system, would an Atomos unit between the webcam and the switcher be the best, or would there be a monitor top camera with HDMI out?
Yeah, what I don't know about this Connect, it looks interesting. It's actually got a screen on it, so you can see the webcam there. What I'm not clear about is whether it's going to pass your control information. If it's not passing the control information to the camera, it's useless. as far as I'm concerned, I mean, as a webcam, as a webcam converter. So the question really with this that we would have to test is it able to pass that data? And maybe I'll buy one from Amazon, see how it works, and see if it's worth keeping or not. So we'll see what we can do there. Next question.
Paul Wallace in Austin, Texas. Would you pay $40 a month for these AI services? OpenAI's ChatGPT, Rewind AI, Midjourney, Superhuman, total $40.
Go ahead, Javier.
I already pay for OpenAI and Midjourney. I don't use email that much, but my wife does, so she pays for Superhuman. So I'm going to take a look at Rewind because I think it's 3 out of 4, so maybe it's 4 out of 4.
And what's Superhuman?
Superhuman is like an email AI. Well, it's launched like last year. It wasn't that AI centric at first, but it was like a way to you can quickly like organize and go through your email, and like it has all of these tools. Like it prompts you like this conversation is about this, so you can categorize like that. It's like a lot of this like Spark and all the email clients that try to do like help you with managing, but I think this one really does it.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
No.
Go ahead, Jason.
Rewind AI will never be on one of my machines.
What is Rewind AI?
That's the thing, remember, that's constantly recording your screen so you can go back in time and see what you've done.
Yeah, I can't imagine anything that would go wrong there. Javier?
Okay, so then it's 3 out of 4. I won't go near Rewind. I have an idea what was it. Now that Jason told me, I'm not trying that.
Next question.
Next one in for Douglas Carmichael. Would there be any server class equivalent with out-of-band management of the B-Link products? I'd be interested in one for an apartment-sized miniature server.
Yeah, I don't have a strong answer there. Go ahead, Courtney.
Well, the B-Links are most of them are Ryzen. They're all x86, so you can run Linux on them. You can run anything that can run a server on it. So you sure should make a miniature server. A lot of people are using miniature PCs like that as server management. So I think you could, depending upon your flavor, whether you want to run Windows Server or Linux.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't have an answer. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael here. Meta is offering an iOS developer certificate program in partnership with Coursera. Would programs like it be more marketable to employers than similar non-branded programs like Code with Chris?
The bottom line is with the training, you just have to get started. Like, it doesn't really matter. I mean, like I just, the main thing is that what you should be doing is sitting down and working through, pick one. And if you don't like it, then try another one. But otherwise, whether it's Coursera or Code with Chris or 1,000 Days of Swift or whatever, or 100 Days of Swift. I think it's not 1,000 days. That would be really long. But 100 Days of Swift, the bottom line is what's most important is to get coding. So if you're interested in getting coding, carve out 2 hours a day, or even 1 hour a day, and just do it. And just make sure that there's a certain time of the day where you're not going to do anything else, and you're just going to do that thing, and you will learn how to code. So it's not. So it doesn't. It really. I mean, you can keep on trying to figure out which one is the right one, but the bottom line is that all you need to do is commit yourself. All of these are people spent a lot of time on all of them to make them usable. And they may not be perfect, but they're all going to kind of move you down that path. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, no decent employer is just going to say, oh, well, he's got a certificate. You're hired. They're going to test you, and then they're going to test you again. And then, if you make it through the third level of test, then you've got a shot at an interview. I wouldn't worry about how you get there. Just get there.
Yeah, and the bottom line is that, it is, you have to kind of, you're probably, if you're over, if you're over 25 years old, you're probably want to be thinking about how you're going to develop your own content. How are you going to develop your own apps? Most companies that are looking for junior programmers that are going to hire someone are generally going to be looking for, you're going to be a freelancer working for them, or you're going to be, as a coder. But when they're in their hiring phase, they're usually hiring junior programmers out of college, and they're hiring junior programmers that are usually younger. We can talk about ageism and so on and so forth, but I think that's really the key. If you're programming older than that, you're really looking at, how do you build something? You're learning to program so that you can build your own apps, or freelance as far as a larger team. So the big thing is you really want to think about what apps do you want to build, and what do you want to solve with coding. I don't know. The hardest part I have is that I don't know how people can just learn to code. Like, to me, you learn. Every time I've done any coding, it's all been because I was trying to create something. Like, I had a problem that I was trying to solve when I was, my first program was written because I got tired of rolling dice for non-player characters in Dungeons and Dragons. I was like, I'm killing these guys so fast. Like, why am I having to go through and build the thing? So I went through and I built all the stuff so I could just hit a button and it would just print a non-player character out. And so that was my first real program was to do that. And I just kept on building programs that solve problems. But I don't know how to even learn. I don't know how to learn anything if I'm not solving a problem. If I don't have a problem to solve with almost any skill, it's very hard for me to absorb it. So think about what you want to actually create. Go through the process. There's nothing better if you're talking to an employer or someone you want to work with. There's nothing better than saying, here's the app that I have on the App Store. You can download it and see how it works. And it should work well, and it should be clean, and it should download, and it shouldn't do anything goofy, and it should be useful. Those are all things that people are going to look for. So, but the most important thing is to start getting those apps built, and I think that that's what I would stay focused on. Next question.
Roscoe Jones in Madison, Indiana, asking, how are you protecting your gear from lightning strikes?
Go ahead, Courtney.
Well, I'll tell you how I'm protecting my gear from lightning strikes. I'm living in Los Angeles, where we don't have lightning, but maybe once every 10 years or so. So I've never had a problem with lightning strikes.
I'm guessing that Roscoe has moved somewhere where there's suddenly a lot of lightning.
Yeah, but to give you a real answer is you could put a lightning arrestor or on top of your house, a little spiky antenna type thing that's connected with a large cable that runs down into about a 10-foot long copper grounding rod that is driven into the ground. So lightning rod is one way to attract the lightning, to discharge it before it gets a chance to harm your stuff and run it into ground safely. But the problem with that is if you're connected to the grid, lightning can strike, 4 houses down from you and come in on your electrical service, on your telephone lines, or on your cable TV lines, and sneak into your house. Lightning is very sneaky. It likes to jump from metal item to metal item and travel around your home through the wiring. So there's no foolproof way. The best way is to carry good insurance or live in California.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, and stay away from Fort Myers, Florida. It's the lightning capital of the U.S. I was down there for a while, and it can get messy.
All right. Just a quick reminder, we've got it's a busy week this week. We have Proso acoustic panels tomorrow. So Rick Matai will be here, and he's going to be talking about acoustic treatment questions, probably both with his services and others. So you definitely want to check that out. I know a lot of us are trying to figure out how to make our spaces a little less echoey, and he's going to be talking a little bit about how that actually works. Really excited about Thursday. We've got HDR, the Objective Color Metrics. Chris Seeger, Michael Drazen, and Jim Toten are all going to be here. Chris Seeger is the NBC Universal's Director of Advanced Content Production, and he is deep into this. And of course, we've had Michael and Jim on the show before. It's going to be a very deep Thursday. So I think that it's going to be a great second hour. And then Friday, we're going to be talking about the production show and tell. Production show and tell, people like me and other people here on the panel that have things that they've done in the past. We'll show a couple pictures, talk a little bit about what the challenges are. And so we'll be talking about that on Friday. And then finally on Saturday, audio description with Joel Snyder. I got to say that you really should be looking at what's happening on Saturday. The accessibility is really, really turning out well. It's really an eye-opening experience, and technically, we're just taking on a lot of new stuff there. So it's a really, really interesting hour or 2 hours to check out. So definitely check that out on Saturday. All right, we are now changing subjects and jumping into our second hour. And we have Alan Hawkes here. And Alan and I, as I've said in the past, are old friends. And we've worked together quite a few times on quite a few projects. And I didn't think that, I asked Alan to come on and like, can you come on every once in a while and talk about some stuff and make it work? And Alan, of course, thought about it for a little while. And now he's got a year and a half worth of monthly things to talk to us about, walking us through the entire pipeline of how the CG pipeline of how it actually works. And I don't think there's anybody better to walk us through this. So really excited to have Alan. And Alan, I'm going to hand it off to you to start giving us a little bit. Now, as you watch Alan talk about this stuff, go ahead and throw questions into Makana, and we'll get to your questions in a couple minutes. Go ahead, Alan.
Thanks, Alex. Good to be here. Happy to share some. Again, we had this discussion a little bit where you were asking me, well, what subjects you want to talk about? And I really kind of realized, well, there are so many phases within the 3D production pipeline. And I thought might be good to just break down each step. Some of them people are probably familiar with, some of them not so much. So today we're just going to be going over the entire 3D production process. I'm just going to be outlining it really quick. I have a quick I'm just going to go through slide by slide and break it down. And as Alex said, if you have questions as I'm going along, just make note of that or put it in the system and we'll take care of those after. So I'm going to go ahead and share. All right.
That's so pretty.
Yeah, it's beautiful, right? I can't take credit for this. This is a graphic that I pulled, but I've gone through and embellished it a bit. And it really kind of shows the entire production process. So the first thing to keep in mind is you have three main phases of production. You have pre-production, you have actual production phase, and then you have post-production. And each one of these processes has its own specific things to kind of keep in mind and its own steps. And we're just going to be going through all of those. So the first one is obviously pre-production. And the first thing you get is an idea, right? I have an idea. So this is the ideation phase. And all I would suggest about this is ideas are easy. Execution is hard, right? So the first thing you want to do with your ideas, I would recommend just writing them all down and keeping a log and kind of filtering through and deciding on what is the best idea I want to create. And once you have the idea, you actually try to put it together into some kind of comprehensible format or story. And you want to be able to pitch that story to your potential audience. But you need to work out. And let me kind of preface this a little bit by saying the 3D production pipeline in general, think of it as a stack of dominoes. It's a very linear process, and you want to work out every single step in order to maximize your efficiency. Because if you make a change further down the production pipeline, it is a stack of dominoes. So you really try to go through and get your story worked out, get all the details worked out as much as you possibly can before obviously going on to the next step. So after you've worked out your story, you move on to the actual storyboard. And this is where you actually take pictures and produce visuals. And I'm sure you've all seen this. The storyboarding phase is where you kind of hash out the ideas and see how everything flows. Is the message getting across? Is the story continuity actually, does it feel cohesive?
And to get one of your points of how important this is, one of the things that we hear a lot about with Pixar, and Pixar is probably one of the best at doing this, is that each one of these areas is they're pretty savage about. They make you prove it. At every level, they make you prove it before you get to go to the next phase, because there's so much money involved. This is, when you start going down, the path, there's so much money involved that there's so much weight that starts to inertia that starts to build. So that you see, these are really, sometimes some of these movies might stay in storyboard for months or sometimes years, for some shows.
Absolutely, because the further down the pipeline you get, the more expensive mistakes become, right? So you really want to work out all these details as they are. So, okay. So next we have the animatic phase. So the animatic is when you basically you take your storyboard and you typically sometimes you'll just take the frames from that storyboard. I've seen all kinds of animatic depending on the budget and depending on any number of factors. But the bottom line is what you're trying to do is take it and add your motion to it and pre-record your dialogue and you know, you're getting a feel for how does this play back in a visual form. So animatics can be put together in any number of ways, but what you're trying to do is get the overall timing, the overall dialogue, and a rough edit, not necessarily final, you know, edit, but as close as you can possibly get to, you know, how many scenes are you going to need? What is the dialogue going to be? How is it playing back? So it's, I often joke around that, you know, the visuals in South Park are basically an animatic, right? It's just insanely good storytelling, and if an animatic and the story is good enough, it's visual. It's actually great in this form, but it can be anything from animated storyboards to, again, I've seen any number of visuals. Some people just draw it all out. Some people actually, if you have really good drawing skills, they'll actually add a few additional frames in there. Some people use 3D. It really depends, but the bottom line is you're just trying to get the point across, and you know what it is you're going to be creating. You know how many scenes you need.
Yeah, and you know, I think that, you know, that was my first job in the film industry, was actually animatics for Star Wars Episode 1, and the producers said they probably saved somewhere around $50 million because of the animatics, because we made a lot of decisions. The pod race was 22 minutes when we first started, and by the time it got to the film, I think it was like 7 or 8 minutes. And so there were a lot of things that got cut out of it, but we were able to do that cheaply by having one artist just throwing things together. You know, much lighter versions of everything, and we put a lot of work into it. We were rendering an electric image and compositing with After Effects and building things in Form Z. So it wasn't like we were just throwing together little pictures of things. I mean, it looked like a Saturday morning cartoon, especially, I got to say, once you added sound, Ben Burt added sound to it, it could have been a movie and we would have been fine. Like it was a really, you know, because all those pieces were already there, and it made it much easier once it got to ILM to have it turn into a final piece.
Yes, absolutely. And again, depending on how many the extent of the resources that you have, animatics can look pretty polished and pretty entertaining. Actually, it should definitely get the point or the essence of what it is you're creating across. And this is where you put the resources into hashing out these details before you start working into the polish, into the final, you know, content creation. So absolutely. So the next thing is, once you get it all worked out, you move on to design, right? And this is where you typically get your previs department to work out the details of how your character is going to look. Typically, this involves traditional drawing skills. More and more, this is actually involving some AI, because AI is being used a lot in pre-visualizations. But it's basically hashing out the visuals. What's this all going to look like, right? So that's pre-production. And once you have that all kind of figured out, you move on to the actual production. So first step in actual production is layout. Layout is really, it's about figuring out what assets you're going to need, right? You go through every single scene in your story, and you got to look through and say, what is in this scene? What is in this scene? What is in this scene? Do I have a car? Do I have a character? Do I have a living room? In that living room, is there furniture? Is there, you know, whatever object you're going to need? So it's really a process of laying out your space that you're going to need to visually show, and then figuring out exactly the assets that you're going to need. So ideally, when you finish with the layout, you have an asset list, and that asset list, and then you go through and create an asset list, so you know everything that's going to need to be created to produce your shot, right? And once you have that, you can move on to R&D. So research and development, right? And this is where you say, okay, we know what we're going to be doing. We know what it is we're going to be creating now. How are we going to do it? What are the tools? What's the latest and greatest tools that we have out there? What's the software we're going to use? And what is going to be our production pipeline? You go through, you identify the technical challenges, the visual challenges, any challenges associated with it, and you say, how are we going to approach this? So it's really just about coming up and prefiguring out and identifying all the different types of effects you're going to need and how it is you're actually going to go about creating it. So ideally, once you come out of the R&D phase, you know your production pipeline. You know, at least to the extent foreseeable, that you can never foresee every single issue, but you have your general production pipeline. What kind of software you're going to use, what techniques, things like that. So then you jump into modeling. And this is where people are mostly familiar with kind of this phase of the 3D production pipeline, where, okay, I'm going to model something, got to actually go through and create it. And then you go through and you have to actually, once you have a modeled asset, you have to make it look, any modeled asset just shows up as gray and boring, right? So you got to go through and actually texture it. And texturing is where you go through and pull from real world textures. It's also referred to as shading, assigning materials. This is where you get the look and feel. It can involve quite a bit of work to get the materials to read just right, to get the textures to read just right. And depending on what the visual, the texturing can vary widely depending on what do you want this to look like. Do you want it to look completely photorealistic? Do you want it to look hyper realistic? Or, believe it or not, I keep coming back to South Park. South Park is originally animated with construction paper and cameras, right? But it's actually produced in Maya 3D software now. It's kind of like putting out a match with a fire hose in terms of what you're actually creating. But it just goes to illustrate the point.
It did sound like it was a bit of a mess when they first did it. Like it was definitely, what were we doing here? When you talk to some of the artists that were there, it was like, why are we doing a South Park, which was essentially done in paper? Why were we doing it but over time, of course, it scaled up. But I think it was a huge leap of faith when they actually did it, because they did it, 20 years ago or whatever, or more than 20 years ago. I think 2002 or 2003 is when because I think the very first ones they did, the way they were doing them. But I think that they got into that pipeline pretty early, and it was a complete mess.
Yeah, and I've heard stories as well. And again, it's one of these things where we started off with construction paper. Why are we going to the 3D production pipeline? The reason they did it is it's more efficient. Once you work out the details, it's more efficient. But I use it as to illustrate the point where you can produce Pixar style content. You can produce ILM visuals, any kind of high-end visual effects with 3D, but you can also produce something as simple as replicating a construction paper, cartoon like South Park. So it just depends on what the visuals are supposed to look like. There's even things called toon shaders, cartoon shaders. There's all kinds of different effects that you can get in 3D. People tend to think of it mostly as looking realistic, but you can use it to achieve any kind of visuals you want. So after you get the texturing, you move on to rigging. Rigging is actually a very complicated subject. When I was teaching myself the 3D production pipeline, this kind of became an all-absorbing world. I remember spending months and months and months just trying to figure out how to rig a character. So rigging is basically, if you have a character, you have to figure out for all of these assets that you're generating, how does it need to move? Obviously, characters, depending on what motion you want out of those characters, are going to have the most setup. Things like skinning, it's called well, we'll get into it later, but skin, you have to add deformations for skin. You have to do all the controls for facial animations. But the rigging is a very important setup, and you basically have to go through every single asset. Does it need to animate? How does it need to animate? And once you animate, or once you determine how it needs to animate, you got to go through and set up each asset and rig it in order to animate effectively. It's an incredibly important part of the production process. If things are rigged right, then you move into the animation phase, and the animation will go much, much, much smoother if everything is actually properly rigged. So the animation, everybody's familiar with this one. This is where you bring the characters to life. You bring in whatever objects. Animation, people think in terms of just character, but a lot of things can be obviously animated. Cameras can be animated, objects can be animated, obviously characters animated, backgrounds can be animated, effects, dynamic simulations. There's a whole bunch in terms of animation. What we're specifically talking about here, and usually what's worked out, is the primary, the cameras, the actual characters and whatnot. And then once you're done with that, you move on to visual effects. So visual effects is any effects that are built on top of that base render. It can encompass things like, dynamic simulations, fluid simulations, fires, explosions, and any kind of, basically there's when you're talking about this kind of animation, it's actually keyframing. It's manually going through and setting keys and whatnot. But when you get into VFX, typically it's referring to things like dynamic simulations, where the computer is actually going through and figuring out and solving how does fluids move, fires, explosions, things that would basically be impossible to animate. So it's built on top of the base animation that's hand created. So, and once you're done with that, you move on to lighting. Lighting's incredibly important, just as in actual cinema, right? The lighting is very, very similar. Lighting is extremely important for achieving the mood of a shot, and probably one of the most underestimated parts of the pipeline. It's not as simple as just like flipping on a switch, because lighting can actually affect mood so much. And it can affect how things are, basically, it can affect your storytelling very strongly. So lighting would be the next phase. And then once you're done with that, you move on to the final rendering. And this is where the computer software gets to work. All your hard work starts to pay off. And ideally, you just kind of look back and let the computer chug away with what's known as, typically you're using ray tracing. It's a very highly CPU or GPU intensive task, where you get massive amounts of render farms, and they just chug away on all these frames, rendering all these frames. And they produce the frames for you to play back into an animation.
And what's interesting is that in the industry, for about as long as I can remember, what has been considered the right time for a frame to render is about 45 minutes, like for each frame.
Yes.
And what happens is that it just keeps getting better. But I think that everyone's decided that that's their pain point, is 45 minutes. So if it fits inside the 45-minute box, and we're talking every single frame, so that's 24 of those 45-minute, it says, for a second. So a second now that 45 minutes may be split among multiple CPUs. So it may not be in real time. If you've got 2,000 CPUs and you throw a render across 8 or 10 of them, of course, you're getting a frame in 10 or, 5 or 10 minutes. So it's in the CPU time. And what's really interesting is that when you talk about rendering, that CPU time is actually calculated, and kept track of, and often charged for. So, one of the things that they learned at ILM was, if you don't charge for the processing time, you don't invest in the processors. And so what they did is they shifted it over where it was, I don't know what the number was. It was $1 or $2 an hour of using the CPUs, and they built a very complex system that would. There was a system called OBQ that would go out and look for everything that it could manage. In fact, it would even take the indies, the boxes that the SGI boxes that the artists used. If you walked away for lunch when the screensaver came up, the screensaver would go back to the system and go, "Hey, I can take frames, and I can render some frames for you," and it would start rendering to you. And so these are that rendering becomes a big deal. And I guess, McKay, would you say that as you get past the modeling area and texturing, those you think about it linearly, but a lot of times those are all happening at the same time at that point, because you're rendering and you're going, oh, that I need more detail in the model. That texture isn't working. The animation needs, and those things all start to kind of blend together. Would you say that process becomes a little bit more foggy?
Well, I would say the rendering is where that's where you actually start to see your work to come together, and you see the fruit of your labors, so to speak. And depending on any number of factors, like I can tell you my personal workflow. Usually I render either thumbnails really, really small, and just to get something out quickly and get the essence of it. And then I'll render high res, but maybe every second, so instead of 30 frames for 1 second, I'm just getting high resolution frames for every second. Because to your point, there's always things that you think, no matter how good you think you got it, there's always something you missed, and there's always problems that come about. And when you're putting an hour, like you said, 45 minutes, an hour into each frame, that's a lot of downtime. That's a lot of CPU time, and you want to make sure. Basically, mistakes can be expensive in terms of time. So yeah, that there's always something that comes out, and typically you can kind of plan on rendering things at full quality at least 3 times before you actually get to your final. So,
and if you're doing it more than that, you're not managing your time very well. Like one of the things you see with folks who start is often they're rendering full res frames and all the frames every single time, and they're like, well, I had to render all afternoon. And you're like, why are you doing that? Like, why are you rendering during the day? And like you have to think about that pipeline to be efficient. I know when I was at ILM, when we were rendering, I was rendering stuff out, and my stuff took a long time to render. And in the morning, I would take the renders from the night before, composite them in After Effects. One of the reasons that you render in passes is so that you can go into your compositor and you can sit there and tweak everything. You can tweak the reflectivity so you don't render the whole frame. Some people do. I mean, you can render that, and there's some advantages to that. But for a long time, we've rendered things in many passes. In fact, I was again watching Mission Impossible last night, and I saw the infamous shot, which is right at the very end. There's a British Airways shot that John Knoll rendered. And he rendered it in passes, and no one had ever seen that before. And he was at an Electric Image event down in LA, and he showed pass rendering, and it was like literally a 747 when we were all doing biplanes. I mean, everyone's head just exploded, and it changed the way all of us did all of our work from then on. It was like 1995 or something like that. We all started thinking in passes, and like the Queen ship was like 22 passes of stuff that came out that gave me control. So I would comp it, then I'd go to dailies and let it render. After Effects took 45 minutes just to render the comp. And so then I would go and watch dailies, and then I'd come back, and John would come over and take a look at it and give me notes. And then I would fiddle in exactly the way that McKay's talking about. I would fiddle with little changes, like, oh, I'm going to render this little frame, I'm going to render this little thing, and see if I fixed whatever was on my checklist, right? And figured it out. And then I'd render a little test, a little postage stamp for lunch. I'd go away for lunch, and then I'd come back, and I'd look at what I did and see if that was what I needed. And then I would make all the final tweaks. And then about 5:30, I started packaging my render. So I had to send all these passes out. So I had to package the whole render out. And it would take me about 45 minutes to package the render. And then I would send it. And then I'd go to home. And then I'd start over the next morning. And that was all you did all day. Like it was just, I did that for, over a year and a half. You just do those pieces and to get those out. But it's a very logistic with all of these things. I would say, I don't know if you can agree, but it's very logistical. Like, there's a thing that I used to have on my wall that said, it was from Omar Bradley, that said that amateurs talk about strategy and professionals talk about logistics. And 3D is a game of logistics, of figuring out, like, how are you actually going to put this out. We think of it as artistic, but it really is a logistical game. Yeah, Courtney, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I had a question, and thanks for laying out this illustrated version of the pipeline. That's really great. One thing I wanted to ask about in this pipeline is, if you look at the credits in any of the major, VFX rich movies like, Indiana Jones 5, which has ILM as one of the major ones, you look at the credits and there may be 10 different visual effects companies listed in the credits. Where do they divide up those responsibilities, and what are all those other visual effects companies besides ILM, if they're the main carrier, the main lead on this? What are all those other visual effects companies doing, and where is that division of labor decided? Is it waited till they get into a time crunch at the end and they have to farm it out? How does that play out? It's on almost every visual effects movie I've ever seen. You look at the credits and they last 20 minutes because there's like 15 different visual effects houses.
I'll jump into that a little bit. A lot of times different visual effects firms have different specialties. And so it's less expensive sometimes, and it's also sometimes more effective. Like, for instance, when it comes to characters, Weta is kind of the world expert at that. Like, because of the Gollum specifically, Weta has become, in Lord of the Rings, Weta really built a core capacity to do characters that is probably better than anyone else in the world when it comes to realistic characters that are going to have all the emotions that you want. And so you might farm out all of those characters to Weta. To make that actually, to get that done. You have compositing teams. So there's sometimes it's not cost effective. A lot of the larger firms got rid of their compositing, a lot of their roto teams and so on and so forth. The roto is usually not done in the United States anymore. Which really caused more hardship than I think they expected, because roto was a kind of a imprecise thing that had a lot of margin in it. And visual effects firms have paid for sending it overseas because that margin went away. And that was a huge error corrector when other things weren't working. I think that you also have, there's ones, the de-aging is another one that's being used. So, that one was used and not credited for a long time, so there was a lot of things in actors' contracts to de-age them using a variety of tools, and those oftentimes they didn't show up until there were some articles about it. They didn't show up in the credits.
Hollywood's best kept secret.
Exactly. It's been going on for quite some time.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think that there's different specialties that they work with. And oftentimes those teams, there's also relationships that the teams have with the directors. The directors have worked with them, and they want them to work on a couple shots, here and there. And oftentimes especially if those shots are easily containable. So I've got a bunch of shots that all belong together. They're not very complicated. I don't need to use the huge CG pipeline to make that work. These are matte shots, or these are a group of shots that fit together that aren't hard to do, and I can hand it off to another team. And it does, to your point, get to capacity at some point. When you talk about a lot of these, a company like ILM might be working on a lot of different things, and it's less expensive and easier for them to hire out some of the work than it is to add to more staff. Because one of the things that big visual effects firms try not to do, they do it a fair bit, but people complain about it a lot, and larger ones like ILM tend to try to avoid, is expanding and contracting. So what they don't want to do is necessarily hire a bunch of artists and then lay them all off. Now there's some companies that's how they work, and it makes the artist a little crazy to be constantly hired in for 3 months and then let go as soon as the project's ended if there's not another project on the other end. So it's easier sometimes to say, well, this is the capacity we have, and we have more. We just hire out. We take the easier shots that don't really require us to work. Also, ILM used to the big thing with ILM is it didn't want to work on anything that didn't require new software. Like if it didn't require R&D, ILM didn't want to work on it because that
They
was
wanted to
George's,
amortize their R&D over that
100%. George wanted to specifically, like he wanted to build bigger Star Wars shots, and so he wanted Hollywood to pay for that development, and so ILM would often get rid of any shot that was wrote. And send it off to another firm to work on because there was no upside for them as far as they were concerned.
Well, the thing you're mentioning is how the work is divided up. Is it compartmentalized into individual series of shots so that there doesn't have to be a lot of collaboration?
Not always.
If you were doing Golem in the middle, you'd have to collaborate a great deal with the people that were doing the background, the compositing, the lighting, all that stuff. But
sometimes it's compartmentalized. Sometimes it's rendered in passes. So passes are rendered by different teams and then brought together. And sometimes they're figuring out the entire workflow so that they can pass their Maya files. That's one of the advantages of USDZ, the Universal Scene Description, is being able to take an entire project and move it from one place to the other. And so they're to McKay's, that R&D that McKay talked about, sometimes that's months. While they're working on everything else, there's months of figuring out how these pipelines are going to tie together so that they can move. And there's lots of tests of, okay, let's move this across, let's move this across. And so it just really depends on the project, but they can do single elements being sent back and forth to scenes being sent back and forth to passes or whole composites. So it just depends on. It also depends on how advanced the visual effects firm is. Like a Weta to ILM is a very well known pipeline. A ILM to somebody in Bulgaria, not as well known, and so that one will be slightly different. Yeah, go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, another reason you may not expect is that the road is littered with failed VFX companies because the margins are kind of small and the implications of what the director does and makes changes puts these companies in and out of business very rapidly. So I think to some degree, they may be spreading the exposure by having multiple companies doing it.
Yeah, it's a logistics problem. And if you don't get the logistics right, you die real quick. Let's go to the first question.
First one in from Dave Troutman in Edmonton, Canada. How much is temperament or patience a factor in creating 3D content?
Go ahead, Alan.
Are you talking about just temperament, just
personal
I think it's just temperament?
Yeah.
Personality?
Yeah, exactly.
I lost my patience a long time ago. You have to have insane amount of patience in this process. To Alex's point, everything he said, it's a logistics challenge as much as it is anything. You're trying to come up with a creative vision, right? To create a cohesive piece of art, if you will. You have a vision in your mind, and pretty much the amount of technical challenges that you're trying to solve around it actually just requires a tremendous amount of patience and planning and just kind of sticking to it and to some extent of patience in terms of this is as good as it's going to get. Like usually any visual effects shot it's basically you run out of time, you run out of budget, or you run out of patience, right? One of those three, and you're trying to get it as good as you possibly can within any one of those limiting factors. But patience is and a level head is just hugely important. And if you don't have it, you're not going to be able to last that long. So,
next question.
Robert Sababity from Poland asks, can you talk a little about a more agile approach to 3D production? Agile processes allow you to fail fast and not go too far before turning back.
I would say that I don't know if this 3D production process is agile in general. I would say getting with the advancements that are happening in AI, with advancements that are happening in the tools, it's getting to a point where you can have a little more of an organic, agile, creative process, if you will. But for the most part, it's not agile. And you have to have control parameters in there. Otherwise, the process is going to control you, so.
Yeah, I mean, I know that when I for a lot of stuff that I did, and I did the same thing in programming that I still do when I do projects, which is that I would do a pass really fast. Like I have an idea for how this model is going to get built, or I have an idea how this shot's going to get built, and I would do it in a day. Like I'm just going to throw things together, figure it all out. And then I'd go, okay, this didn't work. And this is a hard part. And this is something I didn't think about. And then I would go back and just throw everything away. I wouldn't keep any of it. And I would build it again. And I would try to do it correctly. And then I throw all that away. That would take a day or two. Then I would really pipeline it. Like, okay, now I've run up against it a couple times, and now I understand what the issues are, and that's the and I would call that the R&D phase that McKay was talking about there. And then I would build out whatever I was going to do at full resolution and take time to make all my curves correct and make sure that my bevels work and make sure that there's no, poorly formed polygons, and all those things are things that I would do at the very end there. The other thing is that I think the animatics process is very much of an agile. That's where the agileness comes from, is the storyboards and the animatics. Where, I mean, we would do, for a pod race shot, we might do 20 or 30 takes of that shot where we're playing with the camera, we're playing with this other things, and we're cutting it into an edit. We're cutting it actually into a scene and seeing how it works. And so I think that's, and once it gets out of that phase, it becomes a lot less agile. Like as McKay said, it's now this huge tank with all this stuff, and it's really hard to turn. And that's why I think that a lot of people don't spend enough time in pre-production, and you end up with the movies that we get.
Yes. So that's actually one of the biggest challenges we have. If you have a controlled production environment and where people familiar with the visual effects process, they kind of know. I kind of spoke to this in the beginning. It's dominoes, right? You want to lay up those dominoes, and if you make a change early on in that process, all those dominoes are going to fall, and you're going to have to redo everything. And if you don't take that into a factor, it's going to exponentially reduce your efficiency of creating your project. So you have to work out all those details. And one of the biggest challenges I personally have working with agencies are that they just want to be able to make any changes they want at any time very organically, and it just doesn't work that way. So trying to temper this creative process.
It does that work that way if the budget isn't fixed. It works great.
Yeah.
so I would always, like, when agencies would ask me to do something, so I'd be like, sure, it's your nickel. You're paying me per hour. So like I can do any change you want. So
if they pay for the privilege, we'll do it as many times as you want, right?
Exactly.
But
if it's
that's
fixed,
the challenge. Yeah.
And that's where visual effects companies get themselves into trouble, is fixed shot prices with folks making changes. You have to be very careful about your contracts, about what it says you can and can't do, because something that seems very simple, I just want to take this out, or I just want this to move a little bit faster over here, can ripple, as McKay said, or as Alan said, can ripple to an entire different way to do it. Yeah, go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, you mentioned agility, and you were talking earlier about South Park. A lot of people don't realize that show has a production pipeline of 6 days from concept to air. Mm-hmm. So they think of it, they write it, they record it, they animate it, and it airs within 6 days, because they can tackle topical subjects of what's going on in the news this week, et cetera, and make fun of it. So, that's probably the steepest pipeline, because a typical animated half-hour animated television show, is 6 to 8 months. It goes to Korea or to do the in-between, to do all the ink and paint or whatever is done now, digital ink and paint. And it comes back, and so it can be, 8 months between the concept or writing to the air date. But South Park is a different animal. 6 days, they typically turn that show around.
I often bring up South Park as an example precisely for that reason. That's why I said South Park is a glorified animatic. And that is where you have the flexibility and that agility that you're talking about, because those visuals aren't so polished. It's all about story and timing. So I actually use South Park. I'm like, a good animatic is basically, South Park is a perfect glorified animatic. So
yeah, and I think that what's really interesting to see is how Unreal is going to change a lot of this stuff. I mean, even when we were using Motion Builder, which was probably 15 years ago, 15 or more years ago, doing real time and being able to watch the whole thing in real time, build all your cameras in real time. And then, in Motion Builder back then, we would have to still hit render, but it would take a minute to do the entire scene, as opposed to days of rendering. It wasn't as good a quality, but now when you look at Unreal, there's so much there. The only little tricky parts right now are some of the camera effects and anti-aliasing and stuff like that. But as that gets done, I think that especially when you're thinking about, like I look back when I was much younger, I look back, I watched it now and I don't think I thought it was nearly as impressive as I did when I was in my 20s or whatever. But there was a show called Reboot, a little all CG. It was the first all CG Saturday morning, cartoon or whatever.
Canadian production, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it was called Reboot, and I always want to reproduce that, like in Unreal, just to see what it would like. Like I've often thought, like if I had time, I would just do scenes out of that. It's my two big bucket things is scenes out of that or scenes out of Johnny Quest, all in Unreal. It'll be fun. All right, next question.
Next question in from Bobby Rafferty in Florida. Has 3D tools become more accessible for people to use beyond the studios?
Yeah, I would say. I mean,
yes, absolutely. Well, there's no question. 3D is actually getting to a point, especially with, I think we're about to see one of the most, with what's happening with AI. Once AI hits 3D, we're going to see an absolute explosion in potential ease of use, where you're going to start, it's going to be much, much, much more accessible. So I would say, it's been accessible actually for a long time, but it hasn't been easy. So accessibility and easy is different. 3D, the whole process is just insanely challenging and labor intensive. There's no way around that aspect of it. So
yeah, even when you think about the concept drawings and so on and so forth, what I do in Midjourney now is, insane compared to what we would do before. Like, and just to come up with ideas, whether you use them or not, it's really moved a long way forward.
Yeah, imagine what happens when 3D hits Midjourney, when those two worlds combine.
Give me an object here.
It's already happening, like in Blender. They're writing things where you can combine Midjourney, where you, instead of modeling a tree, for example, in detail, you just model a sphere and a little trunk, out of a cylinder and a sphere, and you tell 3D, this is a tree, and let something AI basically generate a tree for you. Yeah. It's not there yet, but you can see the potential being there, and that's going to massively increase the ease of use and efficiency of creating 3D. So
and now you're even in Photoshop, you can sit there and just paint out spaces. You can just go, I just want a river here, and I want hills here, and you just kind of just with a real thick pen just do that and hit go, and it'll just build a scene for you. Again, people say, well, that's all going to replace it. Right now, the problem is you don't have enough explicit control to really turn it into a film. But as a concept drawing, it works really well. Go ahead, John.
Adobe Project Gingerbread is their new 3D product it's in alpha testing right now. It looks fabulous.
And it's doing generative?
Yeah.
That's really cool. Next question.
Next one in from Robert Sababity in Poland. What does a one-man 3D studio look like, and what sort of project can such a studio work on?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
This is a one-man 3D operation right here. Small stuff. I mean, pieces of things is what you generally get when you're small and you specialize. I do a lot of motion graphic work, and I've been lucky enough to get some trailer work out of Hollywood, and that means that I'm doing DVD boxes in 3D, and moving them around, and nothing glorified. It's just kind of grunt work, but I'm happy to have it.
Yeah, probably one of the people that I would say is probably one of the best, and I don't know if he's still doing this or not, but one of the best one-person studios was Eric Chauvin. He was a matte painter at ILM, and then he went and moved far north of Seattle and lived in the middle of nowhere and just did visual effects. And the visual effects he did were for Lost, Alias, and when I say he did some of the visual effects, he would typically do all the visual effects for that show. And they would take all the raw plates. And if you do a search for Blackpool Studios, you'll probably see some images. I was looking for the website. I'm not sure if it's up. So I'm not sure if he's a little older than I am. He may have retired. But he, amazing artist, but really fast and really understood just how to throw things together. But if you look at if the demo reel's up there, if you look at it, we'll see if we can get him on. He was a single person And they would send him something, and the same thing. They would send him something on Monday. On Friday, he'd send back the shots, and they'd all be done. And so it just depends on how quick and dirty you can do a lot of those things. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, if you want a good example of this, look, do a search for 405 the movie, and this, here's a still out of it. These two guys created this little visual effects short that's really entertaining. Bruce Brannett and Jeremy Hunt. And it'll show you what quality of effects you can do. And this was with the tools that were available 10 years ago. When did this come out? 10 or 12 years ago? 20 years ago? No, really?
I think.
Oh, yeah, it was 20 years ago. Yeah, it was
20 years ago. So we've come a long way. So it used to take two guys. Now probably one guy on a weekend could have turned out the quality of this stuff. But it is possible to do with, a limited amount of equipment, a limited budget, and just the time to put into doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, so along the lines of what everybody was saying, what you can do in a one-man studio relative to what you used to be able to do, it's ever increasing. And with the advent of AI, I can only imagine that content generation, it's a double-edged sword, and it's almost too easy, right? But it's incredibly powering to a very small crew and or a single artist. But I think we're about to see an exponential curve in what a single artist can do in the upcoming years. So,
next question.
Jack Rupel in Breckenridge, Colorado asks, when is 3D content necessary or just fluff on content?
I think it just depends on how you use it. I think that a lot of times, I think we've gotten past a lot of the fluff phases of 3D. I think we use 3D because it was 3D for there was a decade of us just making 3D logos and 3D everything and 3D this and 3D that. And I think we've gotten to a point where it's mostly used for something. Go ahead, Alan.
You kind of touched on my point there. It's really just a question of context. In terms of visual effects, the context of visual effects, when is it fluff? I always look at what are you trying to tell in the story? What visuals are you trying to achieve? Is 3D going to be a viable option? Well, it depends. It depends on the challenge of creating it in live footage. In other words, is there a specific reason to create it in 3D? Some special effect you're trying to get, and if not, no, you don't need it. So I try to only use it where necessary.
Good, Courtney.
Yeah, if you're like me, you've become jaded against CGI and big motion pictures these days, because I think the general audience is becoming tired of seeing, things with, transformers with 5,000 different moving parts that are just so complex that you can't even watch them. And CGI has become, a lot of directors are turning back to doing practical effects, which we were talking about earlier, because of this, people are kind of getting tired of CGI in major motion pictures these days. So if they're invisible effects, those are the greatest kind of visual effects that people don't even realize are being spoon-fed, CGI stuff, because it's so good they don't know it's there.
Yeah, I think when people say they've gone back to practical effects, what it means is they're spending the proper amount of money for the digital effects. That's my opinion. Is usually they're putting the time into it. I think that good example is Avatar. I think it's some of the best CG I've ever seen. It's impressive. And that's what can happen if you have an unlimited budget. Next question.
Next question in from Paul Wallace in Austin, Texas. What is drawing entities?
I'm not sure what the context is for that question. So unless, stumped us.
I don't know that one either.
Yeah, I don't know that one. Next question.
Robert Sababity from Poland. What sort of size, storage size are necessary to work with 3D productions, say for a 1-minute film?
I think that would depend on resolution. It just depends on how big it is. Go ahead, Alan.
Oh, I was just going to say, size is not really an issue anymore. We have such a massive amount of data for storage for so cheap. You got a couple terabyte drive, it'll handle most of your projects. So
yeah, the big thing is to make sure to back it up, because usually there's so much work in every frame that you just don't want to lose the project file. So that would be the key to the operation. I can tell you back in the late 90s, ILM, when I was working on Star Wars, 7 terabytes a week. That's what they generated for Star Wars, which would be nothing now, but back then it was a lot of drive space. Next question.
Nikhil Kamkar of New Jersey. I'm very interested in the previs part of the pipeline and anticipate that it'll change in a lot of ways with AI and other tools to help us get to a version that can get a positive lock on director approval. Thoughts on how previs will change?
I've had directors look at our previs and say, is the film shot going to look as good as this? And we're like, yeah, it's going to look better than this. Like it's, you can do, and that was 15 years ago. I mean, it just depends on how much detail you're able to put into it. And that comes back to the storyboarding and the planning, because a lot of times we can build really great previs if we're not zigzagging. Zigzagging is just the death of many projects. Go ahead, Alan.
I had a thought on this about what's going to be happening with previs, and specifically what AI is going to be bringing to the table here. If you pull up Midjourney and enter any prompt, and let's say you're going to use Midjourney as a pre-visualization tool, if you actually had to try to create in the 3D realm things that Midjourney are creating, it's putting a tremendous task on these 3D artists. So at least in the short term, I'm looking at what's happening in this previs, because you're going to have these art directors looking at what this AI is generating, saying, "This is amazing. I want everything to look like this." And the 3D artist has to go in and figure out, okay, now how do I actually create this in the 3D world or the visual effects world? Not necessarily the easiest thing. So one side effect of AI, and this is just my personal thought or observation, is that it's actually going to put more challenge to the 3D artist to be able to generate the kind of look and feel you're getting off of what AI is doing,
Yeah,
so
100%. Next question.
Jack Rupel in Breckenridge, Colorado. Could you use AI to estimate cost for changes in production? For example, a director wants different or more.
It's really hard. I mean, the game of how you charge for things, I think, is even more complex than AI can handle. The bottom line is you need to charge 3 times what you thought you should charge. And then usually it turns out that simple thing is usually enough to manage most things. Go ahead, Courtney.
Well, the problem with AI is it hallucinates, and you don't want something hallucinating when it comes to budgeting. And so there are spreadsheet programs that are out there that are designed for budgeting that lets you plug in different production days. Oh, we got to shoot nights instead of days, And it will take that into account and recalculate your budget and tell you how much over budget you're going to be or how many more days you're going to have to add to the production schedule in order to complete it on time. So there are tools out there right now that are basically based on old school spreadsheets that do a lot of this stuff. AI, I'm not sure how much AI you'd need. You could call it AI, but it's basic algorithms that are built into macros into those spreadsheets.
Next question.
Dave Troutman, Edmonton, Canada. I'm seeing a lot of iPad apps for storyboarding. Has this changed the way animation is being done or just for live action work?
The iPad apps are great. I have to admit, the iPad app that I still use for this is Keynote. I just build a bunch of files and I'm sitting there drawing inside of Keynote, and I can go through it and rearrange things and build those out. I've tried a lot of other apps, and I just haven't found one that was as fast to come up with ideas as that. So I don't know how much it hasn't changed, and I do it for CG or live action. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael asking, what entry-level training would you recommend for Blender?
I don't really know about Blender. I think the issue with Blender is that it's great. It's got a lot of great tools and it's gotten better. It's just that no large production companies use it. I mean, they use it for little bits and pieces here and there, but they don't really, it's usually still something that, and it may change. Apple's giving them money and Epic's giving them money, and it might get better. But it's just not as, I think that people who use Blender really want to sell us on the idea that it's the future, but you just don't see it like, so I would, there's tons of videos on YouTube about Blender. You're just not seeing the same investment. I think that Maxon does a better job with Cineversity. If you're able to get into if you're able to get an educational version. By the way, my son is learning Cinema 4D right now, and it's $10 a year or something like that if you're at school. So if you're in a school or you're able to take something that qualifies, it's not expensive to get into Cinema 4D. Maya, Houdini, These are all things that get used a lot, for those types of things, and they have their own educational programs. So I would take a look at those before if I was really trying to do this for work. If you're going to do all stuff for yourself, Blender might work, but I just don't think it gets oversold a lot. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I mean, if you specifically want to learn about Blender, LinkedIn Learning has a bunch of courses on Blender, essential training and animated, creating character animation, etc. in Blender. So you can look there. They're fairly cheap, and you can get a variety of courses. So check out LinkedIn Learning for that specific Blender tutorials.
Next question.
Bobby Rafferty in Florida. What tools are you using in collaboration with your 3D pipeline?
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
What specific tools in collaboration with my 3D pipeline? Well, basically you have 3D and you have comp. Those are the main things. So I'm using Nuke. I'm using After Effects. Pretty much those are my tools. Like mostly I'm using 3D software and compositing tools. So.
Next question.
Robert Sababity in Poland. Alan, can you talk about the criteria that you use when you say that something does not need to be 3D?
That's actually a great question. So again, getting to the point of what a few people have brought up here, I think the 3D market in general, visual effects is kind of overly saturated. So there's the question of just in terms of how much consumer demand is there for visually, 3D content or whatnot. I think the novelty of it is kind of worn off a little bit. But from a production aspect and from a storytelling aspect, I just look at it and say, what is the most efficient route to get to the visuals you're looking for? All of my learning, all of my every question I ask myself is production focused, meaning what are you actually producing? 3D is just another tool for actually producing that. So my personal question is it going to be advantageous to use this in 3D? Is there another way we can do it better? So it really is just meeting the technical and or creative demands of the shot. Is it necessary? And if it is necessary, what tools are going to get us there the most effective way? So,
next question.
Douglas Carmichael asking, Blender 3.6 touts an improvement in packing UV islands. At first glance, they look like toys packed in a box. How are they used?
I don't know. Not a lot of Blender users here, so I'm not sure.
I'm not sure about that one. I have a really good friend who uses Blender all the time. He's kind of a pro. Maybe I'll get him on here eventually. So.
Yeah, that'd be good. Next question.
Jack Rupel from Breckenridge, Colorado. Can you discuss volumetric 3D content?
And I'm not entirely sure. There's a lot of different ways to think about volumetric, so I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to. So I need a little bit more context. Maybe on another time, we're going to be doing this once a month. Ask that question again, or ask it again in a week. I'll try to figure out, but a little more context there of what you mean by that. Next question.
Next question from Nikhil Kamakokar from New Jersey. There's a thought that no matter what creates all the assets for VFX by AI and such, compositing will remain the key aspect that will need human point of view. Is compositing the most important component for the future to focus on? Nuke, for example.
I don't know if it's the most important, but I will say that your entire shot comes together in your compositor. So, now there are AI tools that are going to make that easier and easier and easier, things that are going to find edges. If you look at a lot of the stuff that's happening in Resolve and Fusion, you're seeing a lot of development right now. I think that Nuke is still the big one that people use. After Effects is very popular. Fusion is coming up faster just because they have a lot more engineers. So when you look at the velocity of development, Fusion right now has got is coming up faster than the other two. Then After Effects tends to be a little bit more towards the the motion graphics with some visual effects, and I did all the visual effects I did on After Effects, so it's definitely capable of that, and still does a lot of those things. Nuke is like the kind of the heavy hitter in a lot of those areas. The tools are amazing. But again, I think that where we see the most number of features coming out that are kind of solving a lot of the problems that we need are Fusion. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how these all work. I do think that it still requires a lot of human touch, but the AI stuff is going to, just help you do it, not necessarily replace the artist, but let them do it faster. Next question.
Next one in from Douglas Carmichael. I know Fusion 360 is a stalwart of the 3D printing community, even for those with limited 3D backgrounds. Would Blender be an heir to the throne in that market?
I don't know. I think that a lot of people are still using Fusion 360, and then I think Blender is a very capable thing to do prints with. And again, it's free, and so it has a lot of tools that would be useful for that. So it definitely is possible to use it there. Go ahead, Courtney.
If you're talking about 3D printing, accuracy of dimensional accuracy is really important. And I'm not sure, I haven't used Blender that much, so I'm not sure how Fusion 360, is very accurate from design to printout. And I'm not sure if Blender maintains that level of accuracy, thousandth of a millimeter accuracy when you're designing models. So,
all right. Thanks, Alan. I think it was really good to have that. That was a great walkthrough of the overview. Now what's going to happen is Alan's going to start working through each one of these. And so you can kind of take a little trip with us through that process over the next year and a half, and which I'm really excited about. And so I think it's going to be a real, let us kind of chew on that and understand it. And I know Tuesdays are still kind of new for us with the graphics, and we're really excited to have Alan. We're going to have Nick on more often as well, and then have some of our own discussions. And so so we've got a lot of stuff coming up. So stay tuned for that. Thanks to the panelists. So we can't do this without you. And great conversation this morning. Great questions in the morning from our producers. We thank you for asking those questions. The earlier you ask the questions, the better. It gives us time. I get up. One of the first things I do when I get up is I open up Makana and I read all the questions. And so that's about between 5 and 5:30 is usually when I get back from the gym, and so that's usually, so it's not right when I get up, but I look at it at that time. I think some of us do. It depends on what the time zone is. And it gives me time to think about the questions and figure out which ones to do. So the earlier that you can get those questions in, the better. So definitely throw those questions in as early as you can. And really just think of one question a day or 2 questions a day that you can throw in there. And you will keep on. It's good for all of us to have those questions. It may be personal to you, but it might solve a lot of other people's problems as well. We traveled 64,000 miles, 103,000 kilometers. That's 509 million bananas for scale. And again, thanks so much to the incredible production team on the back end that makes this happen and allows us to do this law reversal every day. The production team, the development teams, the management teams, all of those things. And another reminder that we have our show workshop at noon today. And so it's kind of a place, if you're thinking about being on the panel, thinking about editing the show, think about any of the aspects of this, being a reader. We basically do a pseudo show at noon, every noon Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and let you get a chance to play with all of those things. We've kind of gotten to a point where it's harder just to jump in. And so if you're interested in that, go ahead and show up for the show workshop. All right, let's go ahead and jump into After Hours.
Job, Alan. Thanks again.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, we even have whispering in 3D now. Yeah.
I actually didn't get to the last part of it. There was like 4 more pages in there for post-production, but we'll cover
To
it
be
later.
continued.
To be continued.
We'll get back to it. So much. All those little black and white guys be animated. Like working. Then we just need to do motion capture. That's the key to the operation.
That would be fun.